Today, the webinar is going to focus on revising your college essay. And so what I mean by that for this presentation is the personal statement on the Common App. So some of these things could be applicable to supplemental essays, but primarily going to focus on the personal statement. All right, so first, what I'll start with is just a little bit about me. If you don't know me, my name is Spencer Harrison. I have over 10 years of teaching writing experience at the university level. I have a MA in creative writing and English literature. I have a MS in education. I've reviewed over thousands of essays, and I most recently received a Fulbright scholarship to Kazakhstan. And so a lot of what I suggest and recommend to you comes from my experience preparing that application for Fulbright, which starts with the first suggestion. So the first question is going to be, how do I know when do I revise my essay? Um, so the first suggestion I would give you is you shouldn't start revising any one essay until you try and write at least three different versions. And so when I say three different versions, I don't mean, a draft, multiple drafts of the same kind of essay, but three different ones. So for example, you could write one essay on your volunteer experience, particular stories you have related to that, write another essay related to your academic interests or something like that. You could write a third essay if you have experience on a sports team, something like that. So the point being three different essays, right? And then you can sort of compare between those three and see which one you like the best and choose that one to revise. So I wouldn't start revising an essay until you do something like that. I would suggest you not write more than 10 different versions. And I've gotten close to writing 10 different versions for my essays and applications. And so at that point, I would stop writing that because you do have a limited amount of time. And so then you have a lot of material to compare and are able to decide which one you feel like is the strongest and just go with that one. All right. So when revising, there are, two basic concerns. You're either going to be adding information or cutting information. So, what I have on the slide right now is just some strategies on how to add information, and this is going to be the bulk of the presentation today. So I'm just going to mention these strategies really quick. But then I'm going to go through an example of an essay that sort of goes through these transformations. And then right before I do that, I'm just going to give some very practical tips on how to cut things down in your essay. So for adding, so I should preface this by saying there's a million different ways to write the essay, different kinds of essays. There would then be a million different ways to revise your essay. But what I'm going to show you are some just practical, strategies that I think anyone could apply, no matter what kind of essay you're writing. I would almost always say it should include some sort of story about your life and your experience, a memory that you have. And with that suggestion, then one sort of simple, straightforward thing that I would suggest you start with revising your essay is adding more sensory detail, sensory information. So just what you experienced with your five senses, sight, sound, smell, what did things look like in the moment, the story you're writing about. Because number one, that should be the easiest thing to start with is just the concrete, literal details. And that should hopefully help jog your memory and then lead you to the next suggestion, which would be adding details related to introspection, basically what you were thinking and feeling at the time. And so, if what you were thinking and feeling at the time is not immediately accessible to you, hopefully adding the sensory information details should help you recreate that moment and then either help you remember what it was you were thinking and feeling in that moment or help you and be able to recreate what you were thinking and feeling in that moment. So that's why I suggest you would start with adding sensory detail, add in then some thoughts and emotions, because ultimately you're trying to, you know, tell the admissions committee, the admissions officer about yourself. The rest of your application is going to be grades and activities and lists and things like that that ultimately can look pretty similar to any other applicant. So this is the one opportunity to really show who you are as a person And the best way to do that would be through, describing your interior experience. And so with that, once you have those two things down, some details related to sensory information, introspection, then I would suggest you sort of turn that into what I call memoir style writing or emotional filtering. So that's going to be sort of the bulk of what I focus on in this presentation and going through examples. So what that is will become clear later in the presentation. And then the last suggestion I would give you is figurative language. To add figurative language, something like metaphors and similes. I think those would be the most important. That's going to help, help your writing stand out, especially if other students aren't going to be using that, which not everyone's going to. And it also just adds another sort of layer of depth and reflection. And so once again, I'm going to go over examples of that in the sample essay drafts that I'm going to cover. So that's just a very brief intro on what to add, and I'm going to go into more detail of that in the example. So before I do that, I will just give some very practical tips on cutting information. So especially if you are over the word limit. So if you don't know, or as a reminder, for the personal statement for the Common App, the word limit is 650 words. So it won't let you submit an essay that is greater than that. And so it should give you a word count within the application itself, so you'll know. But so I always suggest you start with adding information when you're revising the essay and then only worry about cutting at the very end. But just so you have an idea of some ways you might do that, especially if you're over the word count already, um, is some simple strategies. And so I'm going to go over and give some brief examples about that. So the brief intro overview is to look for lists. So anytime you're listing items in a series, separated by commas, those can be good opportunities to either shorten that list or try and come up with a word that encompasses all the items in the list, and that way you're going to be cutting down the word count that way. Then also something that happens a lot is students will use multiple adjectives to describe something. And so I'm going to give some examples of that. But anytime you're giving multiple modifying words on something, you can also cut that down to just select the most important one. And then any kind of repetition. So that could show up in a lot of different ways. Um, ultimately, I'll go through some examples on how to cut that down. So for the first one, going into slightly more detail, but still just a very basic example of looking for lists to cut down on. So a list obviously is going to have at least, three items, but sometimes more. And so especially if you have more than three items in a list, that's going to be something that you can look at to cut down on. And so a lot of times what happens when students or just anyone writing is going to be listing things is hopefully the items in the list will be the same kind of word, same category of word. And so a lot of times each item in the list will start with the same sort of introductory set of words. So the most simple example and concrete example is going to be in this list that I have here. I volunteered at a hospital, a nursing home, and a clinic. So anytime you have each item in the list starting with the same word or words, you can go ahead and just put that once in the beginning of the list, and then it's understood that each of those items in that list is sort of automatically or implied to also start with those other words. So this is the simplest example I could give you just to sort of illustrate it, but oftentimes that can come in the form of multiple words. But so that simple example that I give you would turn into I volunteered at a hospital, nursing home, and clinic. And so that way you cut down. On that example is just two words. But the longer that list is and the more complicated those introductory words are going to be, and the more lists you have in your essay that you can apply this to, you start to get a significant number of words that you are cutting down. And so then the sort of shortest way to cut down on this list is the example I have here at the bottom. I volunteered at multiple healthcare facilities, right? So if you can come up with sort of a larger category that encompasses all of the items in the list, that is also going to be the sort of way to cut down on the most words. So one question that's going to arise, right, is when do I do this? It may be important to include and keep the whole list or part of the list. And so really that's going to come down to what is the overall point of your essay, and then keeping in the most essential things to support that point. And so if you had more room, you might include all these details and more. But since you do have a limited number of room, you just got to make sometimes some tough decisions and leave out information that is just, although would be good to include, is less essential in this situation. So that can be a difficult thing to do, but hopefully these strategies give you some insight on how to do that. So that's a very basic intro for lists. And then so now I'll go into, again, very simple examples of multiple modifiers. So a lot of times students will, use adjectives to describe themselves to try and get a point across. And so, this first example I have is I'm strong and resilient. And so anytime you have two adjectives describing the same thing, and again, you're trying to cut down on the words, just get rid of and choose only one of those modifying words. Especially in this case, I made it kind of easy. Those two words can kind of mean the same thing or they share similar qualities. So especially if your two adjectives modifying words are pretty similar, just go ahead and pick the strongest one. Even though they both will add something, you got to go ahead and just pick one. So that applies to if you're describing yourself or if you're describing objects, right? The food was delicious and tasty. Just cut that down to pick one of those, whichever one you feel like is the strongest. And then also just as an example, you can be describing actions, right? Not just yourself or objects. So you could say, I ran quickly and swiftly. Again, pretty similar, so just go ahead and pick one of those. And so obviously it's going to get harder when those words are different. I'm strong and I am also happy, right? Those would be two different things. But if you really are trying to cut down on words, just try and pick one of those that is most important. And so I'm going to go into a little bit more later about matching up these decisions with sort of in order of importance, right? And the overall points. Okay, and so the last thing that I'll mention again quickly is repetition, cutting down on repetition. So this could be ideas that repeat themselves throughout the essay, right? It shows up in the first paragraph, it shows up in the second paragraph, multiple times in the essay. So when I talk about repetition, that's the first way it could happen. And so again, when you have longer pieces of writing, repetition can be a good thing and even necessary, especially if you have a really long piece of writing, right? You're going to have to remind the reader what you wrote about. But 650 words is certainly on the shorter side, and so it's definitely going to be less necessary to repeat things. So if you say something in the beginning, it's going to be less important for you to repeat or reiterate that idea in the middle. And so again, this can be a good technique that you want to include, but if you are up against it and just need to cut down on things, one thing is to look for repetition. And so the repetition can show up in multiple ways, not just at the idea level. It could show up at the sentence level or even at the word level. And so that's the example that I have here at the bottom. And so one sort of practical piece of advice that I have is if you have the same word or the same phrase repeated very close to each other, particularly in the sentences next to each other, there's almost always a way to rewrite those two sentences so that you can combine those two sentences and only use the word or the phrase once, right? And then you're cutting down on multiple words. So the example I have here, right? I volunteered at multiple healthcare facilities, period. Each healthcare facility I volunteered at was a unique experience. So again, this is a pretty simple example, but since those are the same phrase repeated close to each other, you can rewrite it to something like, I volunteered at multiple healthcare facilities, comma, each one a unique experience. And so that combines those two sentences, lowers your word count, and helps you out that way. And so, you might be thinking all these examples I've just gone through are really small, right? And some are only going to cut down on maybe one word or two words or something. But if you apply this to your whole essay and in aggregate, right, suddenly that's going to be a significant word count. And so if there simply are not sections that you can cut out, at that point you really start have to look at the word level. So the strategies that I just described. And so if you're worried about revising and you're like, I'm already over the word limit, I don't have anything I can cut, I don't want to add anything more, I can almost guarantee you there is always a way to cut significantly down, even at the word level. So don't worry about that. All right, so those are the basic cutting ideas that I have for you. And so now I'm going to switch to revision in terms of things to add and according to the list of strategies that I just had for you in the beginning. All right, so what I'm going to switch to now is an example of a student essay. So what I have on the screen is an essay of a student I worked with. And so what I'm going to show you is multiple drafts of this that went through, I worked with this student over a significant period of time. I gave them suggestions at each stage, and they revised it accordingly. And so this is not just ultimately one single revision that I'm going to show you. And so there's four drafts that I'm going to show you, and I'm not going to show you the whole essay each time. I'm just going to show you the first couple paragraphs and how they change over a few drafts. And then at the end for the last draft, I'm just going to show you the whole essay and show you how some of these revision strategies that I'm talking about showed up there. And so I'm going to try and go a little quick through these first drafts because these are, the non-exemplary versions, but I wanted to give you an idea of where these things started and what is possible and how to go from each draft to draft. So I will just read this quickly. The first paragraph here of this draft. I keep coming back to this moment that probably does not matter that much, but has been stuck in my head. I was washing dishes and I remember feeling really frustrated. The sink filled up too quickly. There was never enough space to rinse things properly, and I had to keep rearranging plates just to get to the ones at the bottom. I felt like I was doing extra work for no reason, and the more I tried to go faster, the more inefficient it felt. I remember thinking there had to be a better way to do it, not just like work faster, but actually change the process. I started wondering if there's some optimal order to washing dishes that minimizes water use and time, or if the whole setup of a sink just makes it inefficient no matter what you do. I did not come up with an answer, but I kept thinking about it even after I finished. All right, so this was one of the very early drafts, not necessarily the first, but as you'll see, even just a few small things to point out, right? Even in this first sentence, I keep coming back to this moment that probably does not matter. So obviously, any kind of language like that where you get some uncertainty or self-doubt, unless you're really gonna address it and show how you overcome it later, you should not include. And this one is actually really saying it at the writing level, right? Like I'm not even sure if I should be telling you about this. That's not a good intro. And so ultimately what I just read to you, right, was centered around the student and the memory they had, a memory they had washing dishes. And so certainly at this point it's not at all clear why they are telling you this. And so that is going to lead to my first suggestion and going to be the first change from this draft to the second draft. Um, is to try and give an intro of why you're telling the reader this story, so you can kind of try and answer that question up front. And so one suggestion I give to students is to come up with an explicit statement of their career and education goals. Because ultimately, what are you applying for? You're applying for college, and so to mention that in the beginning, and it may seem obvious, but to remind the reader that that is what you're heading for and what your goal is, and then get a little specific about what that is, can just help orient the reader and sort of quiet that question in the beginning of why is this person telling me this? So it's not always the best strategy, but it certainly is one. And so I will show you that really quickly. And so I'll point out one other thing that you see in this second. second draft. So again, the advice I gave here was to get rid of some of that sort of informal and um, self-doubting language, and then also put in a career and education goal. And that actually also usually helps take care of some of that self-doubt because the student then knows why they are writing this essay. So here's a second draft. I plan to major in mechanical engineering in college and pursue a career designing and improving everyday systems and products. That goal connects back to a moment that first made me think differently about how systems work. So this is not at this point an exemplary version of this. It's pretty clunky. I mean, it's very straightforward. It's just I plan to major in mechanical engineering and work on everyday systems and products, which is pretty vague. And then a very abrupt transition. That goal connects back to this moment I'm about to tell you about. But nevertheless, that does sort of the basics of take that question away from the reader of why you're telling me this story. It gives us some sort of framework to work with. So I'll continue with just the first two paragraphs of this essay. I was standing at the sink, feeling frustrated as I tried to wash a stack of dishes that never seemed to get any smaller. The sink filled too quickly. There was not enough room to rinse everything, and I kept rearranging the plates just to reach ones at the bottom. The process felt inefficient, like I was doing extra work for no reason. Instead of moving on, I kept thinking about how it could be improved and whether the system itself was the problem. That question led me to look more closely at dishwashers and how they are designed to solve that same issue. I became interested in how water flows through the machine, how spray arms are positioned, and how small design choices affect whether dishes come out clean. That shift from frustration to curiosity pushed me to go further. I tried to take apart part of our dishwasher to understand how the spray systems worked and why certain areas clean better than others. I was not able to fully reassemble it, and my parents were not thrilled when figuring it out, left the dishwasher in more pieces than it started with. But the experience made something clear. I wanted to understand how systems are built and how they can be improved. All right, so suddenly, just with that, even just that small sort of change in the beginning of saying they want to um, become a mechanical engineer and work on what was a little bit vague in the beginning, saying everyday systems and products, we now know that that's why they're telling us this story about washing dishes at the sink. And then the dishwasher, right? Because they are starting to um, work with these ideas that a mechanical engineer working on everyday systems might, right? The task of washing dishes and how a dishwasher might accomplish that. So, seemingly a very mundane example, and is one of the reasons why I picked this essay to go through, is because you don't necessarily need some sort of big, high achievement topic to pick in order to write a good essay. And so, that is going to start to really show through in the next draft of this, which I will show you um, in a second. But you can already see that there are the first suggestion I gave of adding sort of sensory detail into the draft, you can see is already starting to come in, right? The first version we kind of just got, I was washing dishes at the sink. If you'll see here, we also get some additions of the introspection, right? What the student was thinking and feeling. They were feeling frustrated. They have a stack of dishes, right? It's not getting any smaller. We're starting to talk about um, some details here of what was going on in this scene, and we start to get to know the student a little bit. These are just the early stages of getting to know this student. So with that, I will say the next draft, right, that I'm about to show you, the suggestion was what I talked about in the beginning, right? Adding even more sensory detail and then adding more introspection. And then we're also going to get the introduction of the figurative language. And so you'll see an example of that. So ultimately, I'm showing you then I'm skipping multiple drafts ahead, right? What I'm about to show you was not the absolute next draft. It was actually something that took a few drafts. And so I just want to make that clear, that it's not something that you necessarily need to do all at once. But for the purposes of the presentation, I'm going to show you just kind of jump ahead a little bit. All right, so here is the first few paragraphs of this version. All right. I plan to major in mechanical engineering and pursue a career designing and improving everyday systems. That goal traces back to a moment when my thinking began to shift, less like a sudden realization and more like water finding a new path, gradually redirecting itself towards something more efficient. All right, so already in this first paragraph is where we see the introduction of some figurative language. So in the previous draft, we got just a pretty bland statement, right? About I want to be a mechanical engineer, and then I'm going to tell you about this memory. But then now they also tell you a little bit more about why they're going to tell you about this memory because they had a shift in their thinking, and then now they're also going to take it one step further and they're telling you a little bit about this shift in thinking, right? That it wasn't a sudden realization. It is more like water finding a new path, gradually redirecting itself towards something more efficient. Okay, and so the simile here literally is going to be comparing their sudden realization or their shift in thinking, excuse me, to water finding a new path. So we get a sort of metaphorical rendering of their thinking with this image of water finding a new path. And so this also highlights another aspect of why I sort of give these suggestions in the order that I do and saving adding figurative language for the end is because you can draw your figurative language from the things that already literally appear in the essay. And so in the previous version of this essay, right, we were already talking about examples involving water, dishwashing, dishwashers, things like that. And so water is a more obvious choice then to choose for implementing figurative language because it's already in there. And so it's going to be less of a leap and less of a jump to just use that figuratively. So that's why I suggest waiting till sort of the later stages to put the figurative language in, is because that can be kind of hard to come up with in the beginning, just from on a blank page, right? But if you're already looking at what you've written, you can turn some of the literal details into metaphors. Okay, so I will keep going with this draft. All right, the second paragraph now. I was standing at the sink, sleeves damp against my wrists, the sharp scent of dish soap rising from warm, cloudy water. Plates clattered as I shifted them, reaching for ones buried at the bottom. The sink filled too quickly, leaving little room to rinse anything properly, and I kept repeating the same motions without making progress. It felt like water trapped in a basin, circling but never flowing forward. I remembered thinking, why does something so simple feel so inefficient? That question lingered, slowly wearing away at my assumptions until I began to see the problem differently. Maybe the issue wasn't how I was washing the dishes, maybe it was the system itself. All right, so hopefully you can see at the beginning we have the addition of sensory information, right? Before, all we got was washing dishes at the sink. In the next draft, we got, you know, washing dish, a stack of dishes in the sink and a little bit more detail. But here we have even another level, right? So the first addition is damp sleeves against the wrists. Then we also get the sharp scent of dish soap rising from warm, cloudy water. You get plates clattering. You get plates buried at the bottom. You get the sink filling too quickly, and not a lot of room in the sink, and repetitive motions, right? And so that is an increase in just sensory information. And so just doing that in itself without sort of knowing why or having any particular goal, what does that do? It helps the reader imagine what you're telling them, right? It engages the reader. And so something, especially like the college essay, the person reading this is going to be reading a lot in the row, and they're not going to have a lot of time or energy or effort to put into any one. And so the easier you can make it to draw them in, the better. And so the kind of most simplest direct way of doing that is inserting images that's easy for the reader to imagine, right? And relatable images. And so the sink, damp sleeves, dish soap, cloudy water, those are all going to be things that are easy for the reader to imagine. And so again, seemingly maybe not, they don't seem that important, but then the next level of what I'm going to point out here is that these these details actually do also have a purpose. And so this is what I initially referred to as memoir style writing on that first slide or emotional filtering. And the point here being is you're not just going to select sensory information details just for the sake of doing it, but you're going to select details that also reveal your emotional state at the time. And so if you remember the emotional state that the student was talking about in the previous draft was frustration. And so the student here has selected details that sort of point towards that feeling of frustration, right? So damp sleeves, right? No one likes the feeling of damp sleeves, so we're already getting a sort of negative connotation from this detail. Um, the next detail, dish soap, right? We don't even just have the detail of dish soap, we have it described as a sharp scent, right? Which is sort of an unpleasant thing. And so again, pointing to sort of a negative experience. And then the next sort of detail contributing to that would be cloudy water, right? Rather than clear water. And so even just in this first sentence, you're giving the reader the experience that you had, and you are including only the details that point to the emotional experience that you had. So not only are you giving the reader just images to sort of imagine and engage with the reading with and draw them closer in, which in and of itself is an improvement, but the student also selected the details that point the reader towards the experience that the student have of feeling frustrated without even saying it, right? They don't explicitly say this is a frustrating, this is a negative experience. They're just giving you a bunch of details that sort of point to that. And so again, the person reading this is going to be reading this very fast and they're not going to be going into and thinking about it sort of as deeply and in as much detail as I'm explaining to you now, but they won't have to if you write it in this way, right? Because you're sort of overwhelming them and keeping it focused on just one particular kind of description of a scene that points to emotional experience. So without even them kind of knowing it or engaging too much, this is already going to give them this kind of emotional state or closer to it, right? Than just some sort of bland description. All right, and so I only went in depth in that first sentence, right? But you can see some of the other details in the paragraph also give that impression too. Plates clattering, right? Noisy noises, plates buried at the bottom. There's not just some on top of it, others, they're buried. The sink is filling too quickly and repeating the same motions. And now we start getting some explicit statements, without making progress. And so that also is starting to point to negative emotions. So, and then importantly, right, here is where we start to get the literal and explicit versions of what the student was thinking at the time. And so here it's very clearly stated, I remember thinking, why does something so simple feel so inefficient? That question lingered, right? And so you get a little bit more sophisticated statement of going from just the student saying, I felt frustrated to a little bit of a deeper and uniquer version of that thought of why does this feel so inefficient? So anybody can say they felt frustrated. Anybody can just name an emotion. So that in and of itself, just doing that, sure, is going to let the reader in on a little bit more about who you are. But then if you leave it at that level, it is going to be a little bit generic. And so if you can put that in a little bit more context specific language, like you see here, the thought of wondering why this thing feels so inefficient, that suddenly is going to be more unique to the individual, right? So rather than just learning that the student felt frustrated at washing dishes, we know that they actually were thinking this is inefficient. So most students are not going to have these thoughts related to just washing dishes, is starting to think about why the efficiency of this. And then the student here points to that leading to another thought of this question about them still thinking about it and why is it important. Okay, so then I'll just quickly read you this next paragraph of this draft. That thought stayed with me when I started paying attention to our dishwasher. I noticed details I had ignored before: the low hum of the cycle, the sudden hiss of pressurized water, the uneven way droplets clung to certain dishes after it finished. Running my fingers across a plate, I could feel where grit remained, where the system had failed to reach. I began thinking, excuse me, I began thinking about how water moved through the machine, how spray arms directed its force, how angles and pressure shaped its path. My curiosity deepened, branching outward like tributaries, each question leading to another. Okay, so the main thing I want to point out with this paragraph is the last sentence here, which is where the second time now that we get some figurative language. And so they are comparing their curiosity and their curiosity deepening to figurative language, a metaphor here, or excuse me, a simile, branching out like tributaries, each question leading to another. So compared to the beginning, I'll jump back to quickly where we have the figurative language of water finding a new path, a singular path. So something like a river is what you might envision. Here we have that sort of singular path branching outward like tributaries or branching out into multiple paths, right? And so here is where you start to get into more sophisticated writing, right? So again, what does the simple fact of including metaphors into an essay do? If that's all you do without any sort of intention, right, is you give the reader sort of a visual image to hang on to that's describing, in this case, an abstract concept. So if you only got, in this situation, my curiosity deepened, that's abstract, right? There's no right way to really visualize that. You just kind of have, you just have the words there. But if you compare it to an actual image here, branching out like tributaries, water branching out like tributaries, suddenly that abstract thought is associated with an image, and again, you get the reader to engage with the essay in a new way, and it reinforces what the student is literally saying through images, right? So if that's all you did in your essay is add metaphors for that reason, that already increases it. But what else is happening here? So, as I was starting to point out, right, um, we have this simile in the beginning of a singular path of water, something like a river. And then now we have a development of that simile, of that singular path branching out into multiple paths. And so, one thing the student could have just done, right, was just reuse this same literal metaphor at the end without changing it, which what that does is it gives the essay a sense of cohesion, right? And so that is a good example of repetition. Um, but then at that point, you're also not deepening the essay anymore. And so the student takes another good step here of repeating the same kind of metaphor, but not just repeating the same literal metaphor. And they are deepening that idea, the metaphor itself, which then mirrors the deepening of their thinking when they are describing their experience and their thoughts, right? And so what you're starting to see is this has multiple levels, multiple layers, all kind of reinforcing each other. So especially for the sake of time, I'm going to skip down and show you the final version of this essay because um, now I'm going to show you the end result of cutting. So the previous draft, right, we added everything we wanted to add, and then it was over the word limit. And so now, even though all of it was good and functioning well, we really needed to cut down and get this under the word limit. So that's what you'll start to see here in the beginning. So we use the same strategies that I talked about in the beginning, looking for lists, looking for multiple modifying words, looking for unhelpful repetition, right? Um, and cut those things out. So this version of the draft starts with: my goal is to major in mechanical engineering and pursue a career designing household appliances. That goal traces back to a moment when my thinking began to shift, like water finding a new path, gradually redirecting itself towards something more efficient. I was standing at the sink, sleeves damp against my wrist, Plates clattered in cloudy water as I reached for ones buried at the bottom. The sink filled too quickly. Water trapped circling. Why did something so simple feel so inefficient? That question lingered, slowly wearing away at my assumptions. The issue wasn't how I was washing the dishes, it was the system itself. So I'll pause here very briefly. If you notice, this is that same paragraph, that same first paragraph from the previous draft, except it is cut down significantly. And so here is an example and one answer to the question of what are the details that I cut if I need to cut them? So if you remember, the student in the previous draft described the water as warm and cloudy. And here we get the description, we drop the warm part and we just have the cloudy. So why did that happen? Um, Again, we're trying to, what's the overall point? So when talking about making changes, we have to talk about the overall point. What was the overall point of this passage? Was to convey to the reader a sense of frustration. So you want to get rid of the details that don't contribute to that sense of frustration. And so warm water is usually sort of associated positively, right? And so we got rid of that detail because we're not trying to convey a positive emotion here, just negative. So we got rid of warm and cloudy and just chose cloudy because that was the most important word to include here. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an introductory insight on what you wanna get rid of when you're looking at these details. Is you first have to determine what it is, the purpose and the point of the paragraph is, and then just get rid of everything that doesn't contribute to that, that distracts from that. Because again, the reader is going to be reading this really quickly, and so you want to lean closer towards just hitting them over the head with something. And so if all the details are aligned and pointing towards one thing, in this case, a sense of frustration, it's going to be more impactful to the reader, whether they're really trying to engage and absorb this information or not. So you want to try and make it as easy on the reader as possible. Okay, so we'll take a look at this next paragraph. I look to our dishwasher, the low hum of the cycle, the hiss of pressurized water, how angles and pressure shaped its path, the uneven way droplets clung to dishes. I could feel where grit remained, where the system had failed to reach. I decided to take apart the dishwasher to see how it worked. As I loosened screws, I felt the resistance of tightly fitted parts, water dripping onto the floor, carrying a faint metallic smell. Holding the spray arm, I studied its small components, imagining how streams of water would pass through them. But as the pieces accumulated around me, so did a realization. I didn't yet understand the full system well enough to put it back together. When I struggled to reassemble it, my frustration returned, but this time it carried beyond me. My parents stood nearby, now faced with a broken dishwasher and a growing pile of dishes. In that moment, inefficiency wasn't an abstract flaw, it disrupted daily lives. Like water slowly carving a canyon, small inefficiencies could build into larger impacts over time. I didn't just want to understand systems, I wanted to improve them in ways that mattered to people. I developed that curiosity in an engineering class focused on everyday appliances. For a major project, I returned to the dishwashing problem and focused on how water flow and dish placement affect cleaning. I visualized streams moving through the system, adjusting angles and spacing to improve coverage. I redesigned the rack layout and modified the spray pattern to distribute water evenly. I watched the streams arc across the setup in consistent paths. The ideas I had been developing were coming together into something that worked. All right, so I'll just pause here and draw your attention to sort of a shift in the writing, right? And so what we were getting here in the beginning was frustration and sort of a negative experience, which changes here in this paragraph to their description of them designing a dishwasher. And so we get different kinds of adjectives describing this scene, right? We get I modified the spray pattern to distribute water evenly, right? And so this is starting to convey a sense of order and design, right? I watch the streams arc across setup in consistent paths. The ideas I had been developing were coming together into something that worked. So distributing water evenly, improving spaces, angles, and coverage, consistent paths, right? Suddenly we're getting a paragraph that conveys a different kind of experience, which in this case is one that's more ordered and structured, right? And so this reflects not only the external reality of the student, but also their internal reality, right? As their mind is suddenly operating in a more orderly way. And so that's the reason why I draw your attention to that is you can show a shift in your thinking, in your interiority, just by the strategic ways that you describe the exterior of your world, right? And so then that is also reinforced with the explicit introspection, the student telling you about their thoughts and feelings, and then also the metaphors. So we'll keep going with the rest of the essay, almost done. I learned that improving a system involves balancing trade-offs between efficiency, cost, and complexity. Some were stronger but less efficient, others were streamlined but less reliable. Engineering does not move freely, it is shaped by constraints. Forced to find the most effective path instead of searching for perfection. I focused on shaping a system toward better performance. That experience shaped the direction I want to pursue. Mechanical engineering interests me because it focuses on how systems function and improvement through design. I could see myself working at a company like Whirlpool, refining everyday appliances through testing and iteration. My early experiences showed me how even small inefficiencies can ripple outward, affecting not just outcomes, but people's daily lives. In college, I hope to build a strong foundation in physics, math, and design so I can apply that understanding to my career. I am particularly interested in fluid mechanics because it directly relates to the questions that first drew me in. I want to understand how forces shape the movement of water through a system so I can design solutions with intention rather than just trial and error. Looking back, what began as frustration at a sink has developed into a broader way of thinking. I now see inefficiencies as opportunities, not obstacles, but starting points. My curiosity has become more purposeful, shaped by what I've learned and where I want to go. Engineering gives me a way to direct that flow into something practical, and I want to keep building on it one system at a time. All right, so that is the end of the essay. And so the last thing I'll point out before I open it up to questions is they sort of bring it back to the beginning here at the end, which is usually a good thing to do in this essay, right? And so they give an explicit statement, right, of sort of lessons they've learned, right, which is to say, I now see inefficiencies as opportunities, not obstacles, but starting points. So this is still kind of, I mean, in some ways, it's not the most unique, profound sort of takeaway lesson from this essay, but it is definitely better than some. It could definitely be stated more generic, right? And then the reason why this gets even a little bit better is because they say, my curiosity has become more purposeful, shaped by what I have learned. And so now they are sort of subtly using the language that they use to describe the figurative language of water following a path, shaped by constraints, by like a canyon, carving a canyon, deepening, and tributaries flowing outward, right? So in this last paragraph, they're actually not literally using figurative language, but they're using the same language they described that figurative language with here. So it sort of echoes and recalls that figurative language they were using in the beginning and throughout the essay, right? So they have shaped, they have flow, something related to water. And so what this does is, sort of the last point I'll make about figurative language is obviously you can overdo it and you don't want to do it too much. But the student has kind of done it smartly here by sort of finding a middle ground by not reintroducing a new literal direct metaphor, but just calling back to it. And so what that does is it gives the whole essay a sense of cohesion. That sort of, you could say, one of the main symbols in this essay is water, and it's been dealt with differently, both literally and figuratively, throughout the whole essay. And so that sort of theme developed gives the whole essay a sense of cohesion, which is something that you're going to want to do so that every detail is pointing towards the same idea.